Hello. Today we're going to talk about photo documentation. We're going to be looking at Civil War photos and photos of the American West. Photographers began recording the world around them. The medium rendered infinite details to record more than the photographer actually saw when taking the picture. And then you could multiply these images in nearly limitless numbers to make available to the public a wealth of pictorial records exceeding everything known before. You're looking here at Antietam. This is credited to Matthew Brady. Matthew Brady took credit for everything that came out of his shop, whether he shot it or not, and most of it he didn't. This is 1862. A Union soldier captured this image of slaves and their quarters at the Hopkinson Plantation on Edisto Island, South Carolina. At the time the Civil War began, 3.5 million blacks were in bondage throughout the South. But one of the first documentary photographers was Roger Fenton, an Englishman who came to photography from the legal profession. This is not his work that I'm showing you. We're still in America here. His first professional work was a series of calotypes taken during a trip to Russia with an engineer friend who was building a bridge there. Fenton founded the Photographic Society of London. Queen Victoria asked him to photograph the royal family and their estates. He became the official photographer to the British Museum. His work excellence led to the print seller Thomas Agnew and Son to commission him to photograph the theater of war and the Crimea. He took a wagon fitted out as a darkroom. He was using the wet collodion process. He took 5 cameras, 700 glass plates, chemicals, rations, harnesses, tools. He bought 4 horses and took an assistant. Unfortunately, his images are pretty dull. They're very flat. They look dull, even though they were taken at great personal risk. But the technology did not allow him to capture the action. All he got was men posing and the aftermath of battle. Now, I'm not going to tell you that they didn't have the same problem in the Civil War, because they did. But the technology was a little better. It was 6 years later when the Civil War broke out in America. Oh, by the way, on the right, that is Matthew Brady. I forgot to mention that. He has stepped in to the photograph with Major General Robert B. Potter and his staff conducting a meeting. That little device in his hand, in his right hand, it was attached to a rotating cap on the lens of his preset camera, so he was able to capture his own image. We're rolling. This is Timothy O'Sullivan's The Rappahannock River. The photographer is unknown on this one. It's Marye's Heights, Virginia. But you know, it's pretty dramatically composed. Even though nothing's going on, it's pretty dramatically composed. When the Civil War broke out in America, there was not a rush of photographers to the front. The American Journal of Photography said, "We hope to see a photograph of the next battle. There will be little danger in the active duties, for the photographer must be beyond the smell of gunpowder, or his chemicals will not work." I'm not sure who told them that, but now these 2 photographs are considered the first moving pictures. It's not that the pictures are moving. Timothy O'Sullivan took them. It's at Bethesda Church, Virginia. Grant is having a series of meetings. And in this one, you see Grant on the left bent over, whereas he wasn't here. Now he is. It was a fabulous moment in photography, a motion picture. Matthew Brady, his close friendships with the government leaders, because he was the premier daguerreotypist in Washington, D.C. He photographed everyone of every stature in his studio in town. He had published the Gallery of the Illustrious Americans, and his sense of photographic documentation impelled him to undertake the recording of the Civil War, and he had the connections. So his friendship with the government leaders got him the necessary authorization to enter the combat zones, and he had very skilled employees. He had Timothy O'Sullivan, he had Gardner, he had, it escapes me, but I'll let you know. He had fabulous cameramen, and he didn't credit them ever. Everything was printed under Brady's studio. This was a picture at the beginning of the war that was taken in his studio. This picture of Lincoln was taken 4 years later on the day he died. He stopped by Alexander Gardner's studio to have this picture taken. Look at the difference. He didn't look great there, but he looks a lot older here. And you see that line across the top? The plate was broken. It was damaged, and because it was the last picture ever taken of Lincoln, Gardner put it back together. Here are the dead at Antietam. Timothy O'Sullivan. It was said that they dragged the bodies around, and I suspect they probably did. Put guns where they weren't, prop people up. I think they probably did. They were dead. They didn't care. The cameramen hurried to the front, where their buggies became known, and the soldiers called them the "What is it" wagon. They had to climb into these fragile wagons to prepare plates during battles. They risked their lives to save their plates, and yet the technology would not allow them to portray the heat of battle. This is Richmond. This is after the fact. The emulsions were too slow. The lenses were too slow. The weapons were outrunning the science of war at that point as well. Men were running across fields and being gunned down by early machine guns. The science of war hadn't caught up with the technology. You saw the generals standing and posing, and then you saw the aftermath, all pretty staged. But the battles that rage around the "What is it" wagons are missing. Here's some of those weapons. Those were Timothy O'Sullivan photos of Richmond. So we have this great weaponry. They love to picture it. That's a naval battery near the Nelson Church in Yorktown. Barnard, that was the third photographer, George Barnard. It's an 1862 image. At the left are arranged loads of canisters, tin cans filled with lead or iron balls, stands of grape shot. It's some nasty, nasty armament. This is the water battery, the strongest of the Confederate works, preventing McClellan's easy conquest of Yorktown that he expected. These are pretty rare, these pictures taken by the Confederates, because the Confederates didn't have anything. Their supplies were mighty slim, and they weren't going to waste it on photography. So there are some, but nothing like the North. Nothing like the documentation in the North. So these are their defenses, the sandbags. You can see the fabulous tall ships in the background. I love these photos. I love the depiction of the times gone by. This is battery number 4. 8 mortars lobbed shells into Yorktown constantly. This is supposedly bomb-proof, protecting them from enemy fire. This is battery number 1. The works are made, they called them gabions, wicker baskets filled with earth piled around built-up soil and topped with sandbags. Amazingly primitive, isn't it? This is McClellan's headquarters. Lots of soldiers standing around. This is the 1st Connecticut, published by Brady and Company. It's hard to know who took it. He didn't credit anyone but himself. And then, of course, you have the shipbuilding, which is pretty fascinating. All of them, and notice the emulsion. It's wet. It's still wet plate. They're jumping into those wagons, coating the plate, jumping out, taking the photograph, jumping back in. So lots of things could have gone wrong to make that funny stuff happening in the negative. Lots of stuff. Most of the Civil War photographs were taken by undocumented assistants. Brady was mainly to be found politicking in D.C., but we know he was occasionally in the field. We have plenty of pictures of him in the field. And we know he once got lost for 3 days after a battle. But he had some sort of degenerative eye disease. And he could not do the work as he got a little older. Here's the man who designed the ironclads. Brady's men photographed every phase of the war that their technique could capture. There were over 7,000 plates when peace was declared. Chief among his cameramen were Alexander Gardner, Timothy O'Sullivan, and George Bernard. You will hear these names again when we talk about the exploration of the American West. And in the meantime, are these not fabulous? Ironclads. And that was William Dirty Bill Porter who designed them. This one is the USS Choctaw. It carried 8 heavy cannons, and they were river ships. Can you imagine? That's awful close to the water for my taste. This is the bandmaster's tent. Their horns, you might notice, are on the table and hanging from the pole. The officers playing dominoes. And this is what it was all about. This is the plantation residence of John Seabrook on Edisto Island in 1862. At the left is his library. It was a separate building. At right is the wine cellar. That white carpet in front of the house, that is cotton drying. It was captured aboard the blockade runner Empire and spread out to dry. And the people doing the spreading are former slaves. This is what the place looked like from the mansion. Some of his freed slaves in front of the library. It would be a smart thing to do, because I imagine those houses which were lit by candles and maybe gaslight, but mostly candles, I believe. If the house went up, you would want to save your library. And of course, everywhere the war went, there were the dead. But something pretty interesting about this, almost all these people died of disease. This is Hilton Island. This is South Carolina. And it was swampy and mosquito-ridden, and they died of disease. Big cannons. There's a soldier right there reading his letters. They caught this company drilling in its quarters. You like the decorative fence there? Armies don't run by themselves. They've got to have people to bake the bread. You notice the bread is stored with the hay. And of course, there's a dog in the picture too. There's always a dog in these pictures. Here they are counting things. The commissary, they're weighing, they're carving, and with the red tape, beloved of armies, recording who got what and when. That's part of going to war. Those are prisoners of war sitting there. Those are Southern prisoners, being very careful not to go near the guns. This, a street in Winchester showing the Taylor Hotel. This street probably saw more marching armies than any town in the war. Winchester, Virginia. Lots of pictures of officers. This one looks so retouched to me, it looks like it was painted, doesn't it? This was a beloved officer, but unfortunately there are no pictures of him while he's alive. But in those days, it wasn't unusual to take pictures of the dead. Actually, it was quite usual. You might never have a picture taken of you while you were alive. So, on the occasion of your death, a photographer might be called because this was pretty important. The railroads really came into their own. This is Lee's cavalry captured Pope's baggage, which had vital information from McClellan in one of those cars. So this was a big deal that he captured that. This is ruins after the Confederates evacuated. They didn't leave anything behind, except perhaps the outhouse and some earthworks. But railroads really came into their own at this point. The camera and the railroad went to war together. South didn't have it. The North had it, the railroads. And they built these incredible bridges. Look at that. Look at the work that went into that. The engineering. That's a viaduct on the Baltimore and Ohio in Maryland. This is a supply train to Bull Run. Oh, these are the engineers. I'm looking for the information in the book as we roll through it. That is the engineers. This is the photographer's wagon who traveled with the engineers. The only one of his kind that was employed by the Army. They built this bridge. This is called a beanpole bridge. over the Potomac. It was built in 40 hours. They utilized those two piers from an old bridge that were destroyed, and the engineers built this bridge in 40 hours. And now the train can roll across it. Pretty amazing, huh? Of course, the wagons bringing supplies over those bridges. Robert E. Lee, the cause of so much misery. I am not a Southerner. This is a battalion. It is the 36th Massachusetts. Look at their colors. They're just rags. They're just rags. This is Company I of the 57th Massachusetts. They went into fighting on May 6, numbering 86 men. Several weeks later, these 9 men were all that were left. This is General Francis Barlow. Look how they lived. This is Timothy O'Sullivan's image. It was taken near the Spotsylvania courthouse. I'm sure you've heard the name. Well, if you've ever studied the Civil War, you have heard Spotsylvania courthouse, and this is the courthouse. And you know, these places, they in my mind, these places are very large. Gettysburg, Spotsylvania, Bull Run. These are huge places. They must be huge places because so much happened here. But the truth is, it was a country village until the war made it so terrible. This is Cold Harbor. This is the Confederate works that stopped Grant's attacks. That tree is what stopped it. Can you imagine? I mean, how would you ever know without these wonderful photographs? This is the kind of ground that the armies marched over. These are Bernard's photographs. These are Confederate rifle pits. They dug out little pits in the ground. They got behind a couple down trees, and that was it. They put up makeshift obstructions everywhere to make sure that Sherman's men didn't get through, which of course they did. This is their rifle pit. They piled all that brush on the slope leading to the rifle pit. Leading into Atlanta, wherever the camera pointed, they bristled with trenches and rifle pits and stakes in the ground. And the Confederates hid behind these defenses because Atlanta was a true prize. This is a true prize right here. This is a big street in Atlanta. But the real prize is right here, the railroad yard. It's called the car shed of the Western and Atlantic Depot. And it was through this depot that Hood's lifeline ran, for Atlanta was the rail communication of the Deep South. So this was the prize. And once Sherman took Atlanta, that's what it looked like. After a bombardment, that's what it looked like. Bernard captured all of this. This is the Georgia Central Tracks. They found the remains of Hood's ordnance trains destroyed to prevent capture. Perfect desolation. This is the city of Atlanta. This is what's left. Now, when Hood left, he destroyed quite a bit. But what he didn't destroy, Sherman finished. They are heating with fire the rails right here. He's not going to leave anything behind that the Confederates could use again. The soldiers heat the railroad rails before bending them out of shape. Some called the final product Sherman's hairpins. This is an engineer by the name of Joseph Bailey. There was 33 ships that were trapped by low water in a river. And he proposed building a dam right here and raising the river to get those ships out. They commandeered 3,000 men to do this, and they did it, and it worked, and they got out. There were some ruthless guerrillas. Quantrill's Raiders, have you ever heard of them? 3 of Quantrill's men sit for the camera here. On the left, you have Fletcher Taylor. That is Frank James sitting in the center. And on the right is Jesse James. Missouri was a training ground for their outlaw ways. This is Lincoln's second inaugural. Gardner and O'Sullivan left Brady in '63 over Brady taking all the credit for the work of his cameramen. All the images were credited to Brady alone. He thought he would get rich after the war by publishing books and having gallery shows. He didn't understand that the people would be so sick of the war by the time it ended, they would have no interest in seeing images of the great national tragedy. He could not sell a book. He could not mount a show. No one cared. They didn't want to see it, and he died broke. It was rumored that some of the glass plates of the war were considered worthless except for the glass itself that ended up in greenhouses after the war. I don't think Brady's did, but I have a sneaking suspicion that other photographers ended up with their plates in greenhouses. I find these images of the war some of the most haunting ever taken. I look at these people who are no longer living. They're probably turned to dust by now. It's a vanished world. I'm overcome with a sense of melancholy that is so strong. How could you not be affected by these images? It was a time of the greatest upheaval in our country. Its repercussions echo to this day. But after the war, these battle-hardened photographers went west. They went with the railroads. They went with the survey crews. They were tough men, and they could work in hard conditions. This right here is a photograph of workers in a photographic factory. I want you to notice the age of some of these people. Those are children. A lot of them are children. This is an English shop. Workers cut and mount stereographic views for home consumption. The public's appetite was voracious. The raw prints hang in the background. The man in the white coat seated at the center is cutting them. Ladies at the table prepare the mounting boards and glue the prints to them, while the 2 boys standing at the left run the finished pieces through a press. And even here, the camera captures not just a scene, but history. Times are starting to change. Men and women are working together in the same shop. But some things have not changed, for children are working with them too. And the clock in the background shows it's nearly 6 p.m. and they're still working. But America is in love with the camera. All across the land, there are photographers and their apparatus, and they set to work. By 1860, there were over 3,000 photographers plying their trade. Sorry, that's not a very good photo. This is Gardner's image of his gallery in Washington, D.C. Whenever you see a photo gallery, I want you to look at the roof, because there had to be a way to let in the light. He advertises views of the war on one side of the building, but he's a better businessman than Brady, because he's advertising the real bread and butter for all cameramen of the era, the portrait work in carte de vis, ambrotypes, and a variety of other techniques. There were hundreds of little studios like Bowdoin, Taylor and Company. This is Alexandria, Virginia. But look at the roof. There's always a hole in the roof. Here's a photograph. This is a Confederate photograph, which makes it very rare. And in the background, on the right, behind the cannon, is a darkroom. It's the portable darkroom required for the emulsions of the era. Frederick Dellenbach. You know what? Let's do the Civil War stuff before we go west. Here's Matthew Brady. And here's Matthew Brady in the top hat. This is the General Staff, Heiselman, and his staff on the steps of the Arlington House, which was the former house of Robert E. Lee in Arlington, Virginia. It's late summer of '61, following the debacle at Bull Run. And here's Bull Run. Remember how I said that places had to be so huge? Bull Run is huge. That's Bull Run. It's named after that tiny, tiny little stream. That's two photographers at Blackburn's Ford by the waters of Bull Run. This is Sudley Springs on the Manassas battlefield. The cameramen left their equipment wagon across the stream, there on the left. They waded over back this way to capture the scene, and they left their footprints in the mud. This is young Timothy L. Sullivan there on the right. This is 1862 at dinner. These are photographers with the Army of McClellan in 1862. This is a portable darkroom. There on the left, that black box, that's a portable darkroom. Can you imagine how hot that must have been? This is O'Sullivan, who has paused by his wagon to have a drink. It's the 4th of July in 1862. Here's young Timothy O'Sullivan. The equipment in this wagon says Brady's, Washington. The two men are his assistants. The one on the left is probably David Woodbury, who was the best assistant who stayed with Brady throughout the war. This is Timothy O'Sullivan's wagon on the left of the bridge. This was built by McDonald's engineers across Bull Run, 1862, just before the defeat. Matthew Brady is standing at the right. His assistant crouches there on the right of him, or on our right, his left, our right. Those are his other assistants. This is the finest picture to come out of the war of Brady and his assistants and their equipment. These are some of the men who took the pictures that Brady took the credit for. Here's Brady surveying the ruins at Harper's Ferry. This is Brady standing again, looking across the Potomac River with the Arsenal ruins in the background. Selfies are not a new thing. This is Burnside, Major General Burnside, who had no idea this picture was being taken. He had just finished posing for Brady's camera operator and had sat down on a sack of oats to read a newspaper. Brady, in the straw hat, instructed his assistant to take another shot and then sat in the chair facing the general. He truly loved to pose with generals. This is O'Sullivan's photograph of his winter quarters with the telegraphers at Brandy Station, Virginia in '63. You have to remember they didn't fight much in the war. It was just too hard. They'd go into winter quarters, and that's where they'd stay and get sick and die until it was time for spring and to fight again. When the armies came to Gettysburg, so did the cameras. This is William Tipton sitting aboard the Tyson Brothers darkroom wagon in front of a house that served Union General George Meade as headquarters during the battle. I recommend a trip to Gettysburg if you've never seen it. It's pretty remarkable. This is the tent of an army photographer in a camp along the Rappahannock in '63. Notice the hole in the tent, in the roof, to let the sunlight in. Whenever the army went into winter quarters, photographers would descend, most of them unknown, and they would live with the troops through the cold months. They just came to sell portraits to the thousands of anxious soldiers to send to their friends and loved ones at home. Their makeshift studios appeared everywhere. Speaking of makeshift, but always with a hole in the roof. This is Jefferson Rock at Harper's Ferry. It overlooks the Shenandoah River. And here is the Jefferson Rocks Photographs establishment. A soldier poses on the rock while the artist aims the camera out the window of the gallery. Chattanooga. This is Lookout Mountain near Chattanooga. Royan Lynn was the Brady of itinerant portrait photographers. He sold himself almost as well as he sold the carte de visite portraits taken at his Gallery Point lookout. He established himself on the summit of the scenic promontory. Lynn sold thousands of images of generals and soldiers posing on the point. Here, Lynn of Lookout seats himself, cane in hand, behind a stereo camera. Over his shoulder is spread the majesty of the Tennessee River. This guy had an eye for grandeur. And here he is at Pulpit Rock, another favorite posing place for his subjects. Lynn, however, was a man of the people. Where you'd always see Brady with generals, Lynn would put himself in a stovepipe hat aboard an ox-drawn wagon. He was a man of the people. He, however, was fascinated by himself. And that's either him or an assistant photographing Brigadier General Thomas Sweeney standing above the group of soldiers at left. See the camera on the right of that building? Western photographers were less numerous than those in the East, but they still put themselves in the picture quite frequently. This is Mississippi's Tishomingo Hotel. At first I thought maybe it was here in Oklahoma, but it's not. And to its left, there's Howard and Hall photographers. I don't know if you can see that in there. It's pretty tiny. But the competition was stiff for Western photographers. Here is Brigadier General Grenville Dodge and his staff posed beside their campaign maps for Howard and Hall. And here they are posing for Amistad and White. So I have a feeling they all sat there, and the one guy from Howard and Hall took this photo and then moved, and then the photographer from Armistead and White moved in and took almost the exact same photo. There's another Washington Portrait Gallery in Vicksburg. Timothy O'Sullivan took this photograph. There's a photographer beneath that tree on the left taking the photograph of this man. This is the Charles City Courthouse in Virginia. And now it's 4 years later. And don't you think O'Sullivan looks a little older? This is Berg Stresser's photographic studio. They attached themselves to the V Corps of the Army of the Potomac. There were 3 brothers. They took their tintype establishment to the front and flourished. They were Pennsylvanians. They stayed with the Army for 2 years at least. They took Lord knows how many thousand portraits. They operated more than one gallery. They charged $1 for a portrait, and sometimes they took 160 in a day. That was big money back then. And they put in a sliding roof, you'll notice. This is the inside. You can see to the right hanging brass or copper frames used for cased ambrotypes. This is one of Brady's wagons at Cold Harbor, 1864. The photographer could step under that flap on the back and develop. He didn't have to climb in it anymore. He could step under the flap, tuck it around him, and do his developing. The camera was everywhere. You see it on the ground, center left? There's a Brady wagon on the right and its operator. That is a signal tower built by General Benjamin Butler. And there's a flag-holding signalman atop it. That's a photographer's printing room. That's Bernard's portable darkroom. Chemicals and other equipment attract the attention of several of Sherman's bummers in abandoned Confederate trenches southeast of Atlanta. That is a daguerreotype studio in the background. But it was probably taken with a wet plate. The exterior portrait like this was probably taken on a wet plate, but he put his daguerreotype studio in the background. This is Cooley with his associates. He obviously felt it paid to advertise. This is a lovely picture. This is all we have of J.L. Dowling of New Bern, North Carolina. He made some remarkable prints of the federal troops that occupied his town. The prints survive, but he's really totally forgotten. But if you look at this is an ambrotype and daguerreotype gallery. It's situated on the 2nd floor above a drugstore. The men of Massachusetts are lounging below, but if you look above that window, there, standing beside the camera, is the artist. This man, he did have style. Photographers sleep in their tent at a moment off. And you got a man, oops, wandering into the picture there. That's a photographic wagon there on the right, probably part of Gardner's equipment. That is a bomb-proof at Petersburg in the fall of 1864. Here's a picture of Richmond taken from the south side of the James River. The war is over. That box is a portable darkroom, and you can see the operator at work. It explains the blur because the cameraman is developing the image. He's ducking down, he's getting under, he's standing up. That building, the white building across the river, is the infamous Libby Prison. This is Richmond in federal hands. There's a stereo camera right there in the foreground. (1865), Grant is cornering Lee at Appomattox, and Brady is already in Richmond posing for his own cameras. This is Pratt's Castle on Gambler's Hill. The man in the top hat is Brady. Look at the retouching on this one. This was made by Levy and Cohen of Philadelphia. It was taken in Richmond immediately after the fall. But Levy died 6 months later from a heart attack, and the firm never published and distributed their prints. The negatives were sold and never presented to the public until this series of books was published in the 1980s. And if a northern photographer was lucky enough to come across some glass plates from the South, he would take them as his own. As happened with this one. This is a Charles Reed print of Libby Prison in Richmond. It was probably taken in '63. It was found after Richmond's fall, and several northern operators published it as their own copyright. But it was part of Levy and Cohen's views of the rebel capital. And at the end of this long, bloody war, we're back at Fort Sumter, and there is a camera on the left. 4 years after the war, that's Samuel Cooley preparing to photograph a once mighty parapet. Here, Cooley is photographing a soldier in the ruins of Fort Sumter in April of '65. And then, all these guys, with all that chutzpah and all that bravery, they can't go home. Timothy O'Sullivan, one of the most daring of the war photographers, he joined Clarence King's geological exploration of the 40th parallel in 1867. He photographed in a mine with magnesium flares, which would be incredibly dangerous to the point of suicidal. In 1870, he was in Panama. In '71, he joined a survey of the American West. They spent a month floating the waters of the Colorado. In 1873, the survey explored Canyon de Chelly in Arizona, which is one of my favorite places. And I owe a debt of gratitude to O'Sullivan because it was his photos that made me love the place before I ever went to see it. William Henry Jackson was another photographer of the West, and he photographed the Yellowstone area and the Rockies extensively. His photographs helped to do a fine piece of work. Without a dissenting vote, Congress established Yellowstone as a national park to be forever set aside for the people after viewing his photographs. On March 1st, 1872, with the signature of President Grant, the bill became law. Yellowstone was our first national park and the start of a great national tradition of putting aside the finest places in America for all of us. So you owe him a debt of gratitude too, because he helped put those places aside for you. But you always have to make money. So there's Wild Bill Cody. And the stereographs, which were quite wonderful. I remember them. My great uncle had them, and I spent many hours enjoying them. There's the way that you viewed them and the way that you could march off into the mountains to get photographs. In 1875, Jackson packed a 20 by 24-inch camera up the Rocky Mountains. Do you know how much glass weighs? The bigger the negative, the more detail you can capture. He recorded 12 of these plates in his log. 12. Think of the weights and you can understand why only 12 were recorded. It seems incredible, but there were other photographers who were using equally large plates being toted into other inhospitable places. Carleton Watkins and Edward Muybridge had cameras of nearly equal size. This picture was taken in San Francisco after the Great Earthquake. Muybridge, we tend to think of him as the man in the studio who took these incredible moving photographs. He's the man who proved that at one point in its stride, a horse has all four legs off the ground. They didn't think that was possible until he took these series. And we'll look at these series later, but he proved that a horse, at one point in its stride, all 4 feet are off the ground. Here they are on a survey, packing the amazing stuff up. Let me see, I have this written somewhere and I'm not finding it. Frederick Dellenbach described the photographer's outfit as the terror of Major John Wesley Powell's exploration of the Grand Canyon in 1871. The camera in its strongbox was a heavy load to carry up the rocks, but it was nothing to the chemicals and plate holder box, which in turn was featherlight compared to the imitation hand organ which served for a darkroom. This dark box was the special sorrow of the expedition, as it had to be dragged up the heights from 500 to 3,000 feet. 2 of the photographers on this survey made a side trip and did not get a single negative. The silver bath had got out of order, and the horse bearing a camera fell off a cliff and landed on top of the camera, which had been tied on the outside of the pack, with a result that need not be described. I'm sorry, I've cut him off. There's a man standing on top of the rock. Probably Timothy O'Sullivan. He was one of the most daring of the war photographers, and he joined Clarence King's geological exploration of the 40th parallel in 1867. He was everywhere. And it always helps to advertise. Alexander Gardner took amazing photographs of the West. The West looks pretty much like this to this day. But they brought back photographs like this one and this one. And of course, these. And we all owe them a great debt of gratitude. And you can't say they weren't artists, because they certainly were, and they went dangerous places. And did amazing things. This is an Ansel Adams. I'm always surprised when they kind of throw him in there, because he certainly wasn't alive during the Civil War. But he did explore the West and was an incredible photographer. And every time I see one of his photographs, I know that it's really special. Photographers who specialized in making these prints, they often found the demand so great for their work that they started publishing companies. In England, Francis Firth opened the first large factory in 1860 after his return from Egypt. This is Timothy O'Sullivan in the West. Firth had a stock of more than 1 million prints available for purchase. They were all contact prints. They were gold-toned albumen paper that was made in vast quantities. Over 1,000 18 by 24 sheets could be sensitized in a day. As many as that's the petrified forest. It looks exactly like that today. As many as 1,300 printing frames, each with a glass negative and a sheet of sensitized paper of the same size pressed against it, were put on racks and wheeled on tracks into the sunlight. I'm sorry, I've never found a picture of this. If it suddenly rained, they could be wheeled right back in. At Wilson's Printing Works in Aberdeen, the racks covered half an acre. The exposures varied with the intensity of light and the density of the negative. The time of exposure varied from 15 to 20 minutes to 2 days. The average daily production was 3,000 prints. The production was 1 million prints a year. William Henry Jackson did the same thing in this country from his facility in Denver in 1883. His life is quite a tale. Be sure and pay attention when they talk about him in your book. We're going to continue out with some of the great Western photographs. They were bold men and women. And after they'd gone out west, they actually took a look at the native people. And we'll talk about this later in another lecture. But they saw that the West itself was not going to remain the way it was, and that the native peoples were not going to remain the way they were. And so there were lots of documentarians. Some of them, like Curtis, would take these moody, artistic pieces about the vanishing people. Although I do love the Curtis portraits. Many of them are some of the most beautiful portraits ever taken. I find this little sentimentality a bit thick. But they took photographs of things that we may never see again. And some of them were so bold and beautiful and honest. And then others were, of course, artistic and a little less honest. This is Gilpin, and look, she's taken a studio out here and set it up and photographed the native women in a studio, which I find really interesting at this point in time. This is Acoma. To this day, Acoma looks just like that, without the horses. This is the road up to Acoma. And of course, now you just get they put you on a bus and drive you up there. Vorman did some beautiful, beautiful portraits. And luckily we have these. Because with the coming of the white man and the railroad and gold's discovery, people poured into the West. And nothing was ever the same. And you didn't have to pose on top of the rock. You could pose under the rock. You had the miners. You had the politicians stealing from the native people. And when the railroad arrived, Promontory Point in Utah. That's pretty much it. The West was over. You had the classic homesteaders. You had the cowboys. This might have been taken in Oklahoma because that's Bill Pickett, the famous black cowboy on the left. But look at this picture. You have black cowboys, Mexican cowboys, Indian cowboys, white cowboys. This is a great photo. It's what they must have looked like. It's what they did look like. Here they are. But that is Bill Pickett on the left. He was famous because in a rodeo, he could bring down a steer, and the way he did it was he bit its lip to where it was in such pain it would just fall over with him. And the black homesteaders too. It was quite a time in the West, and I'm grateful every day that we have these fabulous photographs. See you next time.